Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this video is sponsored by Bethesda, which is good because I like dragons. So when the fine folk over at Bethesda asked if I'd be willing to make them something for the recently released Doom the Dark Ages, I said, sure. But when they said that thing could be Surratt, the big laser-winged cyborg dragon, I said, okay. So, of course, that means I need to make this dragon fly, which is where these handy little brass tubes come into play. These little tubes are sized so the little one fits perfectly into the larger one with zero slop, and because they're square, they won't spin around at all, so I should be able to build my dragon at an angle without having to worry about properly anchoring it. All I have to do then is bend the tube so the little one bends back, then I can fit a bit of armature wire into the open end, which I can then wrap in a layer of aluminium and start building up the shiny metal bones of my dragon. Then once I've added the arms and legs, I'll try and bulk out as much of the body as I can with a lightweight foil, since this single brass rod is going to need to support the entire weight of a dragon, its wings, and a teeny tiny slayer riding on top. And I've already put an awkward kink in the tip of the rod, which definitely doesn't undermine its stability and definitely won't come back to bite me later on in the video. Otherwise, once I've bent the various extremities into an appropriate pose, I can start slapping on the initial layer of clay. The first layer is really just to bulk out the body and cover up the majority of the shiny stuff. Once I've covered up as much as I can and added that first layer of clay though, I can start working my way around the body, adding little bits here and there, creating more of that anatomical definition. Once I've got enough of the clay in place, I can start to add the detail, working my way from the bottom up, which really just means I'll start with the feet and go from there. Ideally, I want to add the detail to the parts of the body I don't need to touch as much first, since I have a tendency to forget that clay is malleable, and I often end up smooshing things I've spent hours meticulously sculpting, tipping my already barely stable mental state into near apoplectic fits of rage. However, with the feet finished, without eliciting an unhealthy rage response, I can start marking out the muscles of the arms and legs. I know I'm going to be chopping away most of the arms to replace it with big metal robo-limbs, but I find it helps to create the underlying musculature as sort of a frame of reference. Which is, of course, intentional and not the result of me completely forgetting that I'll be covering all of this up later. Last but not least, and also not last at all, we'll be adding a bit of detailing to the belly and neck. Then I can completely saturate Surratt in a healthy coating of isopropyl alcohol to soften the clay, so I can use a soft makeup brush that I found in a drawer in the bathroom to gently brush away any of the sharp tool marks or fingerprints I've left scattered around the body. Otherwise, all that's left to do before I bake the body and save my progress is add some surface texture, which I'll do by way of these pre-made trypophobia-inducing scale rollers. I'll roll the rollers back and forth over Surratt's body to create some larger lumpy scales over the larger sections of the body. Then I can use the smaller roller to reach the hard-to-reach places, and the even smaller roller to add smaller scales to the rest of the surface. With that done, I can then poke some divots into Surratt's toe beans and add some pre-baked talons to the tips, and that's the initial sculpting done, which means I can bake the body once and to begin the encyborging process. I'll start by building Surratt's backpack/turret saddle, adding layers of super sculpey, then using a sharp knife blade to cut away sections until I've got a nice flat, sharp-edged frame that I can start carving a bit more detail into. I'll carve out a little dip for the Slayer's future turret saddle at the front of the backpack, then I could start adding the segmented sections to the back of the backpack before moving down to the tail to add the individual armor plates that run all the way down towards the tip. Each of these armor plates then gets a little spike added to the center, and I can add a big hooked spike to the tip of the tail, and to bake the body once again, so I can sand everything flat. With the backpack and tail finished, I can move on to the mouth and give Surratt some great big duck lips, blending them back into the pre-existing head space before adding a little inside of the mouth detail to the inside of the mouth and wrapping some great big gums around the rim. I'll then jam some teeny tiny dragon teeth into my freshly gummed up lips before lining up some horns and pressing them into place on the side of Surratt's head. A little pinching will reshape the horns and I can carve some detail into the surface, then I'm back to adding more armor plates to the top of the neck, complete with their own set of little spikes. With the back plates in place, I can start cutting away the clay of the forearm, since I'm gonna need to replace these limbs with cyborg prosthetics. I'll fill the open palmed paws of the forelimbs with some cosplay, then add some adorable little beans to the tips before turning these happy little hands into terrifying robo claws, complete with a set of repurposed back spikes that work perfectly as cyborg talons curled up into the palms. With the claws complete, I can begin building out the metallic forelimbs in a more easily sandable super sculpey, extending it up onto the biceps and shoulders before blending and smoothing it out to create a slightly more robotic appearance. I'll then add some spikes along the top of the arm and cover it with another layer of armor plating, as well as a little shoulder pad and, of course, more spikes. Finally, at long last, I can build Sirot's hat in much the same manner, adding little lumps of Super Sculpey, then blending it all together and carving the necessary detail into the surface. I'll then do the same thing for the jawline, adding little spikes to the sides, as well as a much-needed cyborg dragon soul patch. I'll then add a few more leftover spikes on top before getting to work building the jetpack. At this point in the process, I'm getting pretty sick of stabbing myself on the many spikes protruding from Sirot's body, so a lot of the detail and sculpting process gets lost as I try and figure out how to hold this dragon without the addition of accidental acupuncture. However, the general idea was adding some tubes to the sides of the body and carving out a section for the wings to be attached with a sort of ball and joint socket. Fortunately, those gems over at Bethesda sent me some 3D renders of the body, so I was able to print out these scaled wing contraptions that I can use to make sure my wings are the correct size and shape. I'll take a length of armature wire and fold it back on itself to create a double thick wire that I can then line up with the cyborg winger and bend it back into the correct shape using a clay cutter to create the circular bit at the base of the wing. A quick fit check to make sure my bones are looking good, and I can drill some holes into the socket joint on the rocket pack, then I can figure out a proper pose for the wings before getting on to adding some clay. I'll start by wrapping the wire in a thin layer of cosplay, making sure to coat the entire wire before baking it once and cutting it back to create a sharper, thinner frame. I can then begin bulking out the rest of the detail with Super Sculpey, using the printout as a point of reference so I know what goes where. Then I'll bake it again and sand the Super Sculpey flat before cutting some of the finer detail into the surface where it would have been a bit too awkward while the clay was still soft. And for those wondering if I put the glove on before or after I stabbed myself with the knife, that's not relevant. No more questions. Otherwise, with the detail carved into the winger, I can start adding the extraneous detail, which, much like the rest of Sirot, is mostly the addition of spikes of varying sizes, as well as a spiky turbine inside the circular bit, which I built off camera and attached to a bit of armature wire, so I can attach it to the wing before covering it in a layer of clay to hide the wire. I'll then add the ball to the base of the wing and finish off refining the shape before baking it all again and sanding all that added clay flat and smooth before repeating this process again to create the other wing, and that's my webless cyborg wings finished and ready for that aforementioned laser webbing. Now, my plan is to make the wings out of some thin sheets of acrylic, but I know who and what I am, and I know that if I just start cutting at the acrylic, I'm gonna cock it up real fast and get frustrated, so before I build the real wings, I'm gonna make them out of cardstock first. You see, the idea is that I can lay my robo wingers down onto the cardstock and trace out the shape, cutting away and refining at it until I've got a near perfect fit that I can then transfer onto the acrylic sheet, thereby leaving me with a one and done clear acrylic wing. And honestly, it's not good, but it is good enough. To attach the wing to the wingers, I'm going to use some UV resin since I want to make sure the connection is nice and sturdy, but I still want to maintain the transparency of the wing itself. This wasn't a particularly elegant or attractive solution since the resin globbed up and looks kind of like the wings were attached using baby's first welding set, but I think I can probably hide most of it with a good paint job, and I think adding lots of these hideous human mistakes really ensures that no one's going to mistake this for a 3D printed model. Otherwise, after a little heat gun bending of the webs, that's my wings finished, which means all that's left to do is build the Doomslayer and his saddle. The saddle, of course, is a turret with a chair that fits into the dip on the back of Sirot's back, so I'll start with a little clay dome that I can fit a seat on top of. I'll attach a console for the gun handles and some padding so the Slayer can ride in comfort. Then I'll fit a little cut length of toothpick through the top of the console and attach some tri-barreled cannons that I made out of more toothpicks and clay. Finally, I'll add a bit more detail by building out the base of the guns, and that's the turret. Mostly finished, which means we can slide Doom Slayer into frame and start building him. Originally, I figured I could make the Slayer separate from the rest of the seat so I could easily paint him then just attach him afterwards, but by the time I'd built the legs and his boots and test fit him into place, I realized I was making the sculpting way more awkward for the sake of making the painting a tiny bit less awkward. So instead I just pressed his torso-less legs onto the seat and started sculpting the rest of his body directly into the chair. I'll clip off the excess wire, then drill a couple tiny holes into the handleless handles of the guns, fitting some teeny tiny wire handles in place. Then I can start building up the Slayer's torso, marking out the arm and head holes, before carefully carving the details into the chest plate. Once I'm happy with how my armor looks, I can bake it to save it, then drill some little holes to fit some arms that I've wrapped around the handles I previously attached to the guns. This will let me build up the arms while keeping them supported, as well as keep my otherwise flimsy, floppy cannons from spinning around. Dark Age's Doomslayer is wearing a fetching black cape, which I'll make sure is floating out behind him majestically before finally pressing this little pre-baked helmeted head I made off camera into place. Last but not least, I can make both of his shoulder pads, then finish them off with some teeny tiny spikes pressed into place. And with that, the Slayer and his turreted dragon riding saddle are sorted and ready to be fit in place on Surat's back. Otherwise, with this final piece in place, I'd say we're pretty much sorted here, which means all I need to do now is make a base for them to be flying over top of. And of course, what better base than a fully fledged Titan demon's face to be blasting a ball of fire down into. I'll start with a rolled length of aluminium looped around into a circle, which I'll then fill with more foil as I slowly start to build up the base of the face, trying my best to get the shape of the shouting demon before I start layering on clay, in the hopes of keeping the cost of this particular project somewhat reasonable. Of course, as soon as I started covering the foil armature in clay, I realized that probably wasn't gonna happen. Which is probably okay, because everybody knows that the weight of an object determines its quality, and this demon head is probably gonna weigh slightly more than a newborn baby. With the general shape of the head looking ship-shape, I can poke some eye divots into the front of the face, then build up the brow and thicken up the lips, smooshing a lumpy nose into place and building up the cheekbones so they're proportionally oversized for the rest of the face, before turning the demon's shocked look into a slightly more angry one. I'll then add the horny chin lumps to the bottom of the boosh and do some final refining before breaking out my pre-formed foil horns. A quick fit check to make sure that these are the right size and shape, and I can cover them in a bit of clay, and then I can press fit them into the side of the demon's head. I'll reinforce the connection points by adding big clay sausages smooshed between the horns and the head, then build out the horns by adding long wormy dealies along the edges of the horns, making them a little less rounded and a little more squared off. A little ball stylus work rolled back and forth will create a more natural looking demon horn, and then I can start carving the segmented detail into the horns, starting from the base and working my way to the tip. Once I've marked out all the segments, I can clean them up and refine the shape so they aren't quite so flat and two-dimensional. With the horns looking plenty horny, I can clean up the nose, adding the strip in the middle before plopping some big eyeballs in place and adding hideous, exaggerated eyelids and plenty of wrinkles and folds. I'll then work my way into the mouth, adding lots of semi-random sausages, mirroring the look on both sides so that I can create the goopy, swoopy, swirly inside of a big demon mouth before pressing a slew of wonky, pre-baked teeth into place. I'll then add some more gummy clay bits around and between the teeth, then blend these back into the rest of the face to help the teeth blend in a tiny bit better. I'll then fit a tongue in place and add lots of wormy dealies stretched across the open mouth to create the not at all unsettling sinews and tendons that make up this demon's jawline. Also, at some point I added spikes to the top of his head, but apparently I forgot to record that part. Finally, I can fix up the face by adding a copious amount of cracks and scars and divots and damage, making it all look a little bit more well-worn. I'll do the same thing to the chin and the sides of the jaw, then I'll do a quick brushing with isopropyl alcohol to clean up the tooling marks before poking some divots into the corners of the jaw so I can fit those oh-so-necessary jaw fingers that any and all demons should have as a standard. And once I've added some lovely long fingernails, I can finally bake this absolute beast of a base and figure out how I want to mount my dragon. I'll line up the brass rod with the back of the mouth so I can drill a hole through the demon's throat and into an MTF disc that I'll use to help support the weight of the tube. To light up my gout of fire, I've got this cheap and cheerful USB light strip that I'll wrap around the rod, but before I do that, I need to expand the demon's throat hole, as well as create a channel for the USB cable to sit inside. Then I can wrap the light around the brass rod, keeping it as tight as possible to limit any sort of cold spot where the light won't show through when it's being lit up. I'll snip the tip off the wire, then I can start turning this LED wrapped rod into a gout of fire with my personal favorite fire material, copious amounts of hot glue. I found hot glue to be the best of the fake fire materials if you take the time to get it right. It dries semi-transparent, so it creates a nice diffuse effect spreading the underlying light, and if you work carefully you can get some pretty good looking fire effects just by pinching and pulling at the still warm glue as it dries. To get a perfect fit inside the demon's mouth, I'll create a barrier with some aluminium foil, then fit the glue-covered rod through the mouth and into the mounting block, then I'll carefully coat the inside of the mouth in more glue. When it's cooled down, I can pull the rod safely out, and with the help of a little isopropyl alcohol, I can take off all the foil, which leaves me with a form-fitting gout of fire. A blast with a torch will remove the inevitable hot gluey stringy bits, and I can blast it with an all-over coat of transparent yellow ink, tickling the tips of the flames with a bit of orange for that added fiery effect when the lights are turned off. And that's pretty much all it takes to make a great looking gout of flame, which means my fire is finished, so it's time to paint the head. I'll start by giving the demon head a nice demon baby blue base coat over the face, followed by a gray glaze to tone the blue down a tiny bit. I'll then blast the horns with an initial light brownish khaki color to lay the base tones, then I'll hit the teeth and horns with the same color before almost immediately covering all of that color up when I coat the inside of the mouth in a dark demon mouth red. I'll make sure to hit the stringy mouth sinew as well as the gum line and along the chin and neck, as well as each eye and around the base of the horns, before adding a touch of shading by redoing the red bits with just a tickling of pink over top. Finally, I'll finish up by coating the high points of the horns with a bone white to add some gradation, and then I'll use my brush to repaint the teeth and fingernails and horns before breaking out one of my all-time favorite shading tools for large, organic sculptures: oil paints. I can remember using oil paints as a kid when I was little, then using straight turpentine from the bottle to clean my hands afterwards, and sometimes I wonder how we as a generation even made it into our 30s. For now, I'm using odorless spirits and gloves and a mask to make very thin brown, blue, and red washes, ensuring that I mix the washes so aggressively that the brown spills everywhere and into the other washes, so I have to make them off camera. I'll then take this thinned out, non-water, watery wash and apply it liberally over all the brown bits of the demon, coating the horns, teeth, nails, and spikes, before mixing up some red to cover all the red covered bits, then doing the same thing with the blue to basically cover the rest of the head. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Good God, Adam, what have you done? You've ruined this sculpture, you've ruined this video, and quite frankly, you've ruined my entire day. Shame on you, and shame on whomever raised you to be this way. Okay, first, that's a bit of an overreaction, but second, don't worry. That's the true beauty of blending with oils. You see, a tiny bit of mineral spirit on a sponge will wipe away the vast majority of the oil, leaving behind wonderful shadings in the recesses and helping to blend the contrasting colors naturally. Additionally, by not clear coating the acrylics beforehand, the oils will penetrate a little bit deeper and stain the underlying color, creating some lovely warm hues. After a few hours, the majority of the mineral spirits have evaporated, and I can come back with some lighter bluish gray on a sponge to tippity-tap a little texture and highlight onto the surface of the skin, leaving those darker recesses steeped in oily mystery. I'll then do the same thing with some pinks over the reds and some beiges and bone whites over the horns and teeths and what have yous that are left. I'll then give the eyes a bright white base coat followed by an orangey wash over top so that I can wet blend some progressively lighter yellow tones into the centers to create a wonky yellow jaundice eye fit for a Titan demon. Finally, to protect all this hard work and ensure I don't get leftover oil paints all over me, I'll clear coat the entire head in an ultra matte varnish, then blast the mouth and eyes with a couple coats of high gloss varnish so they're extra shiny and goopy. And with that, this demon head is damn near done, so it's time to paint a dragon. I'll start by blasting the belly of the beast with a sandy yellow, then I'll top coat the top scaled coat with a darker brown before sponging a between those two colors yellow color haphazardly over the scales. A quick dry brushing with an even lighter tone will help to highlight some of the larger scales, and I can work my way around the yellowy brown bits with a dirty brown wash, adding jagged stripes. Once that's dried, I'll use a little extra watery ivory white to add some final highlighting around these freshly added stripes. Then I can paint the horns with an initial bone white on the base, wet blending khaki into the tips, before coating them in a couple coats of brown washes. Finally, for a little added gradation, I'll tap the tips of the horn with a charcoaly black. Apparently at some point in the process I painted the mouth with pinks and purples, so I'll paint the teeth with a bone white and tickle the tips with a pure white before coating them all again in a sepia wash. With that, the fleshy bits of my beast are done, and I can turn to the cyborgy bits and start base coating them in a dark metallic that I made by mixing some black wash into my Duraluminium premix. I'll paint this over all of the leftover bits of the dragon, making sure not to paint over of my fleshy yellow bits. Then I'll come back with some bright red to add some soft glow lighting to the cracks and along the spikes and around the eyes by messily painting the red and top coating with a brighter fluorescent red. A bit more of my metallics on a sponge will help to clean up any of the overpainting, leaving me with some nice, realistic-looking painted lights. At this point, the metallics are a bit too shiny and bright, so I mixed up a little blue and black ink with plenty of water and flow improver to create a thin, watery, blackish blue wash that I can apply over the metally bits to give it all a cool blue tone, which I can then clean up and texture by sponging some gunmetal gray and natural steel over the top. This will cover up any of the wash that pooled on the flat surfaces, as well as add some texture to the metal plates, and I can come back with a pure silver dry brushed over the edges to help pick out all of the sharp parts of the plating. Finally, a bit of charcoal black on those toe talons, and I can set the dragon aside while I paint the wings. Oh yeah, I also forgot I did this until just now, but I replaced the wire attachment points on the wings with some bolts that slot neatly into cutouts I made on the jetpacks, and I added some magnets to make sure they won't fall out. This makes the wings way more stable without having to glue them in place. As for the wings themselves, Surratt's laser wings have sort of a magical hex pattern that I can't imagine painting by hand, so I went out and got me one of these fancy reusable hex stencils that I can lay onto the wings and blast with a transparent fluorescent red. I can remove the stencil and shuffle it down the wing to continue it further along until the whole of the acrylic is hexed in red, then I'll blast the edge of the wings with a transparent white ink. I'll add the white fingery bits that reach down the wing where the bends are, then I'll flip the whole thing over and make sure I do the back side of the wing in white before using a fine-tipped brush to create some little arcs of white electricity spreading along the wing. Finally, I'll blast the whole wing with a high gloss varnish to protect the paint and give it a bit more shine, then I can coat the metallic part of the wing in that same metallic base coat as the rest of the body, trying to draw clean straight lines where the UV resin got gooped on a bit too thick. I'll add some red inside the turbine and around the spikes, dabbing that metallic over top to clean it up, then I can give the metal bits that same blue wash, followed by a sponged over gunmetal and dry brushed silver. Finally, with the wings finished, we're on to the last of the pieces, our tiny Slayer and his chariot of cannons, complete with some freshly added ammo belts that I forgot to add earlier. I'll start by painting all the metal bits of the chair with the same metallics, followed by a blue wash and a sponging of steel and silver on top. Then I can move on to painting the metallic bits of the Doomslayer's armor, starting with a dark gunmetal gray base coat to cover all the armor plates, followed by a highlighting with a natural steel over top. I can then paint his exposed biceps with a darker pinkish base tone and then some lighter pink highlights on top before moving on to painting all the leathery bits of his armor with an initial dark brown followed by a lighter leather brown over top as a highlight. I can then move on to base coating the rest of the armor in a Slayer green, adding highlights with that same green mixed with white to create a nice washed out tone. A bit more of the metallics around the edge of the armor and along the armor to create some two-dimensional textures and detail, then I can paint all the spikes with a steel and add some final little red dots where appropriate. His big flowy cape gets a black base coat followed by an aggressive gray and white dry brushing to pick out all that furry detail, then I'll messily brush the barrels of the guns with some blacks and grays to create a little contrast before picking out the individual bullet casings that I forgot to sculpt onto the belts. And with that, this Slayer and his laser cannon chariot are looking just about good enough, which means it's finally time to assemble this, I think, pretty epic table lamp. With the head hot glued onto the MDF base, I can feed the cable through the throat hole and mount the brass rod into the base below. Then it's just a case of sliding one tube into the other until the entirety of the exposed dragon tube is encased in fire. I'll attach the magnetized wings into their wing holes, then I can fit the Slayer saddle on top, and that's us done here and onto the Glamour Shots. However, before we get to said Glamour Shots, another massive thank you to Bethesda for sponsoring this video. Doom the Dark Ages is out right now on Xbox, PC, and PlayStation, so if you want to pilot a big cyborg dragon with lasers on its back and blast fire into a skyscraper-sized demon, then make sure you follow the link in the description below. Otherwise, as always, a massive thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a big old hey how are you to the newest of them, Jens, Pat, Iconic Pigeon 17, Akido Silver, Ethan Ward, Amiri Jones, Bulyat, Kogda, Chelinia Baina, Robert Richardson, Alyssa, Happy 16th Anniversary, Cheryl B, I Love You from Doug, Rowan Glenn, Seeker of Dewey, Goblin Girl, Hey Little Peters, Happy Birthday Charlie, we love you so much, and Gator Infested Water. You are the big goat of fire that keeps this cyborg dragon of a channel aloft. A big thank you again to Bethesda for sponsoring this video. Make sure you check out Doom the Dark Ages as it's available right now on Xbox, PC, and PlayStation. Follow the link in the description below. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.